Good morning, dear children of class 8, and I am happy to welcome you all to one more botany class. So today's class will be the continuation of chapter 2 in botany, that is pollination. So today's topic is going to be about pollination. You must have studied about pollination in your previous classes, like in grade 6 all you must have studied, but with some more information we will be continuing the topic pollination for this class. So let's get started. So before learning about the process of pollination and the types of pollination, let's define what is pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is a process where there is transfer of pollen grains. So in your previous class only you have studied about the structure of the flower, all you have studied, right? So you know about anther, pollen grains, stigma, all you know. So in this definition of pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same species through some agent. So what is pollination? It is the transfer of pollen grains. What is pollen grains? In a flower, in hibiscus flower, many have sent me the activity for last week. You have seen pollen grains in hibiscus like round small ball like structures, right? So that transfer, the transfer of those yellow color structures from one plant to another plant, of what it is transferred, to where it is transferred? It is transferred to the stigma of another plant. What is stigma? So in a flower, do you remember the structure of stigma is like this, right? The female gamete has stigma, so this is stigma. So transfer of pollen grains from one plant to the stigma of another plant of the same species, in the sense, say for example, if the pollen grains is transferred from a hibiscus plant, it cannot pollinate with the rose plant. It should be the same hibiscus plant. That is what is referred to as same species. Okay, rose plants pollination will be with the rose plant only. Hibiscus plants pollination will be with one more hibiscus plant only. It should be of the same species by agents. What is this agent? About the agents we will be learning in the upcoming slides. Pollination is through some agent like either an insect or a wind or water. About that we will be learning in the upcoming slides. For this, the definition is pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same species by some agents. Next we learn about the types of pollination. There are two types of pollination. One is called as self-pollination and another one is called as cross-pollination. As per the definition, whatever the type of pollination it may be, it is always the transfer of pollens to the stigma. Pollination itself, it will be the transfer of pollens to the stigma. Then what is the difference between self and cross? Self-pollination can be explained like this. It is within the same flower or the plant. As I told you already, pollination is always the transfer of pollen to the stigma. See, in this flower, where is the pollen? So this is the pollen here, right? Where is the stigma? This is the stigma. So in this flower, if the pollen is to be transferred from the anther to the stigma, if it is going to be transferred here, it is called as self-pollination because it is happening within the same flower. Okay, so this is one possibility. Another one possibility is, see, this is a hibiscus plant and this plant has two flowers. Okay, so where is the pollen? This yellow color structure is the pollen, right? So suppose from this flower, if it is transferred to the stigma of this flower, then also it is called as self-pollination because it is happening within the same plant. So if there is transfer of pollen to the stigma within the same flower, or within the flowers of the same plant, then it is called as self-pollination. Then what is cross-pollination? This is say for example, this is from one plant. This red color hibiscus is from one plant. Okay. So similarly, you have one more plant which is which has pink color hibiscus flowers. Okay. Let this one be plant number 1 and let this be plant number 2. Okay. So suppose if there is transfer of pollen grains from plant number 1 to the stigma of plant number 2, then it is called as cross pollination, that is transferred to another plant, provided it should be from the same species. Always in the as per the definition, you know, always there is pollination only within the same species. This is also yet another hibiscus plant, but its flower's color is just different. That is the only difference, but still it is a hibiscus flower only. So if there is transfer of pollen to the stigma from one plant to another plant, then it is called as cross pollination, provided it should be within the same species. Clear? So this is about self pollination and cross pollination. Next, there is one more process called as artificial pollination. So as I told you earlier, there are some agents of pollination like wind, water or insects, but sometimes there is a process called as artificial process which is manual. What is manual? Manual means the man himself does. See, if it is insect, air or water, no, I mean wind or water, it is through some natural process or through some other insects or animals. Man is not involved in those cases, whereas in artificial pollination it is called manual because man does this. See here in this picture, this man has a brush. It is a painting brush. What the kids use, no, the small brush. Can you see this one? So this is the brush and this is the pollen, the yellow color structure, no, this is the pollen. So now this man, what he does, he removes the pollen from a flower and he collects the pollen grains. Clear? So this pollen grain is artificially dusted to the stigma of another flower. So this is purely man-made. This man collects the pollen grains from one flower and then just he sprinkles the pollen grains on the stigma of another flower. So this is a artificial pollination process. By this method also, of course, pollination occurs. Okay, so there is pollination and like the natural method, here also there is pollination, and the product of pollination is called the hybrid plant. If you get a new plant, then that plant is called as a hybrid. Okay, so this hybrid is much useful to the society, like it has a vigor. Vigor means it is very active in nature. It is very active in its growth or fruit production or flower production. Clear? So it is vigorous and disease resistant when compared to other plants by natural means of pollination. Artificially pollinated plants are more resistant to diseases. Easily diseases do not affect them, and their fruits are very large. Why like that? Because we select pollen grains from a good plant and then give it to the stigma of another good variety of plants. So this selection is, since it is man-made, we select only the best and then we make a plant. No, that's why it gives larger fruits and also higher yields. Okay, so this is the oldest method of pollination. So before, actually the process of pollination was revealed openly, like now we put into categories, no, like there are only 3 categories like insects, wind or water. Now we know. So before these were all revealed, this process was the oldest method. Artificially man began to collect pollen grains and transfer to the stigma. So it is a man-made method. The next topic is about the agents of pollination. Repeatedly I had been telling you there are 3 agents of pollination called water pollination, wind pollination and insect pollination. So water pollination, that is the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma by means of water. In this case it is a transfer of pollen to the stigma with the help of wind. Here wind is the agent and here insects is the agent. Can you see a bee, and this yellow dots is the pollen grains. This is a sunflower and this is the pollen grain. See, there is a butterfly as well as there is a honey bee. So, we will be learning in detail in the upcoming slides how this process happens in these three agents. So, first we learn about pollination in insects. The same picture I have displayed again. A honey bee sitting on the pollen grains. This middle yellow ball-like structures, no, this is the pollen grain. So, as well as a butterfly is sitting on a flower, right? So, what is it doing? Let us see. Okay. So, before that, for a butterfly or for a honey bee to get attracted, when honey bee goes to a flower, only when it finds that there is nectar in the flower, right? Similarly, when butterfly goes to that flower, when it sees some beautifully colored flowers, butterfly usually goes there. Okay. It also, of course, it collects nectar, but most probably you can see butterflies where there are places with colorful flowers, no. So, usually those plants which are pollinated by insects have flowers which are large, bigger in size and showy. Showy means it is attractive in nature, those flowers, and also they are mostly brightly colored. Those flowers which can be pollinated by insects have these properties. Also they have sweet smell. For the insects to get attracted to them, they have a sweet sweet scent, that is the smell, and also they have nectar. What is nectar? The fluid which is sweet in nature in the flower, no. What honey bee all collects, no, that is the nectar. So, the examples of the flowers where insect pollination happens is rose and China rose. Here the pollen grains usually, so how pollination process happens? So, when these insects sit on the flower, the pollen grains will stick on the body of the honey bee or the butterfly. Okay. So, these honey bees and butterflies keep on going to one flower to another, no, they do not choose or stick on to one flower, they keep on moving to different places for collecting the nectar. So, during that time the pollen grains stick on to the surface from one flower, and when they go to the next flower, it will give the pollen grains to the stigma of the next flower. So, what will happen? Pollination will happen. Clear? So, this is about pollination by insects. So, next comes pollination by wind. See this one, is it colorful? Usually the flowers which are pollinated by wind are not colorful, they are white in color, but however they are large in number. This one, no, you must have seen this flying in the air or in your day to day life, you must have seen this. Okay, so usually the flowers which are pollinated by wind are larger in number when compared to, see, one flower itself have so many particles, no. So, it is larger, the number of pollen grains are usually very large in number when compared to other flowers pollinated through other agents. So, which number is large? Pollen grain number is large in the flowers which are pollinated by wind. And the flowers are not colorful. Is it colorful? It is white in color, right? Mostly these flowers are not colorful at all, and also they are light weighted. The pollen grains are very light in weight. That's how they fly in the air. Usually hibiscus pollen grains all you cannot see flying in the air because it is quite heavier when compared to these ones, but these pollen grains which can be pollinated by wind are usually very light, that they can travel in air, that is, they are carried by the wind, and they don't have any sweet scent. Have you smelled this? You must have smelled, right? I have done this in my younger age, but it doesn't have any good smell which is attractive to insects. And usually these pollen grains will go and it will be transferred to a stigma, no? That stigma is usually very sticky in nature and feathery in nature, so that it can attract the pollen grains. This is also one special property of wind pollinated flowers. And there is no nectar also, there is no sweet liquid in these flowers which have the pollen grains which can be transmitted by wind. So, this is about pollination by wind. And one more pollination. So examples are given, 4 examples are given in your book. Pine, maize, rice and wheat pollen grains can be transmitted by wind. They are all having wind pollinated flowers. So this is all about pollination by wind. So one more pollination we have to study, that is pollination by water. So this happens in aquatic plants. Aquatic plants means those plants which live under water, they are called as aquatic plants. So water plants undergo mostly pollination by water. It happens only in aquatic plants, and here the flowers are smaller in size. So you may think it is bigger only, no, but when compared to sunflower all, it is small, right? So compared to the other flowers attracted by insects all, these flowers are smaller in size and non-showy. It is not that attractive. Is it so beautiful, these flowers? No, right? So where is the flower? So these are the flowers. Clear? So it is not showy, it is not so beautiful such as insect pollinated flowers. And one more property, again this also similar to the wind pollinated flowers, water pollinated flowers also are light weighted. The pollen grains are light weighted. Where are the pollen grains? Can you see some red dots? So these are the pollen grains. The red dots are the pollen grains. So the pollen grains usually are light weighted, and the flowers, that is the pistil, the flower reaches the surface because these plants will have a long stalk. What is stalk? It is the stick-like structure which carries the flower, right? It is actually the pedicel. The pedicel is usually very long, so that the pistil, that is the flower, reaches the surface of the water. Okay, and the pollen grains are also waxy in nature, so that they are non-stick to water. They are resistant to water. Water cannot enter into the pollen grains because they have a waxy coat. And since they are light weighted, they float on the water. See, you have many pollen grains, their number is very large, and the pistil, that is the flower, also reaches the surface because of the long stalk it has. Now these pollen grains will reach the flower very easily, and then pollination will happen. That is the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma will happen easily. This happens in 2 plants. Examples are Hydrilla and Vallisneria. What are the examples of aquatic plants which can be pollinated? Hydrilla and Vallisneria are the examples. As I told you, the pollen grains are covered with a waxy layer. Why it should be covered? So that water is not entering inside, and the pollen grains are resistant to water. Okay, so that their properties are, say for example, like a seed, it is soaked in water. What will happen? The nature of the pollen grain will not remain as such, right? So it is designed in such a way that it has a waxy cover, so that the water will not enter into it. It is non-sticky to water. Okay, by any one of these methods, either by water or by wind or by insects or by artificial pollination, now pollination process is finished. What is pollination? Transfer of pollen to the stigma, right? So this is done. What next? What will happen after pollination? There is a process called as fertilization. So this is what is happening right after pollination. Once the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma, this process of fertilization happens. See here, the red ball-like structure is the pollen grain. And what is this? This is the stigma, right? Which is the stigma? So this is the stigma. So now the transfer of pollen grains to stigma is done. What next? So the first step is, okay, before that, what is fertilization? Fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. What is male gamete here? Pollen grain is the male gamete. The process of fertilization is the fusion of male gamete with the female gamete, and out of this fusion, the product formed is zygote. So what is the product formed? It is called the zygote. So, the resultant of pollination process is the formation of zygote. Clear? So, how this zygote is formed, that is how the process of fertilization is happening, is what we are going to learn about. So, the first step we have studied landing of pollen to the stigma. For the process of fertilization, the first step should be landing of, what is this landing, from where does it come? By any agent of pollination, finally it lands on the stigma. No? So, this process is addressed as landing of pollen to the stigma. Okay, it has landed. What next? Next, the pollen grows and reaches the ovule. See, the pollen grains are round in nature, no? It is like a ball. But see here, can you see some growth? A tube-like structure will grow from the pollen grain. It will grow like this. Okay. Can you see here? So, it has grown now. How long it will grow? It will grow down below until it reaches the ovule. Which is the ovule? This is the ovule, right? So, this is the ovule. So, this structure is the ovule. So, pollen grains land on the stigma, a pollen tube is formed and this tube grows down until it reaches the ovule. What next? After it reaches the ovule, the tube tip burst. Which is the tube? This is the tube, right? So, this is the tube. The tip of the tube will burst and it will give the male gamete, that is the pollen grain, to the ovule. So, pollen grains will have the male gamete, and how it reaches the ovule? First, a pollen tube forms and that pollen tube will reach until the ovule. Once it reaches the ovule, the tip of the pollen grain will, the pollen tube will burst and it will give the male gamete, that is the pollen grains, to the ovule. The next step is, there is fusion. I told you, no, there is fusion of male and female gametes. So, which is the male gamete here? The pollen grain is the male gamete. Which is the female gamete here? The ovary is the female gamete. Why? See, it reaches the ovule. Where is the ovule? Ovule is inside the ovary. See, can you see this structure? So, this is the ovary, right? And you have ovule here. So, the fusion of the pollen grain and the female gamete, that is the ovary, results in the formation of, I told you in the definition itself, this will result in the formation of a structure called as zygote. Clear? Now, zygote is formed, and after zygote is formed, it repeatedly divides to form a structure called embryo. Even in human being, you use this word embryo when a baby is first formed. A zygotic cell is formed, it divides repeatedly to form a structure called as embryo. After the formation of embryo, what will happen is the other parts of the flower, that is the petal, sepal, stamen and stigma, everything will fall down. Okay, what all will fall down? Stigma will fall down, the petals will fall down, the sepals will fall down, everything will wither, resulting in the formation of a fruit and a seed. How fruits and seeds? This ovary will become the fruit. Okay, the ovary, the swollen structure will become the fruit, and this ovule will become the seed finally. Clear? So, this is how fertilization happens in a flower. So, this is very important in exam point of view. Understand and learn that, then it is going to be very easy for you. Okay, this is the project or the activity what I gave you last week. Asmi John, Candy, Jeevika and Ilil have done the activity and sent it to me. Very good. It was too good. I don't know how clear it is in this image since I wanted to display 4. Okay, so only 4 from your class. Please others also do activities when it is given, so that it is going to be helpful to you as well as you can learn it clearly, practically, right. So please do the activity whenever it is given. And for your homework part, you have a test in your next botany class. It is from chapter 2, pages 31 to 43. You have to read and also learn the worksheets thoroughly and prepare well for the test. And that is all for today's class, and until I meet you in one more class, you all take care and bye bye.